Okay, this will be my last lecture on World War I. This one's a little lengthy. I'll do my best. There's quite a few pictures here. I'm just trying to paint a picture of what life was like in the trenches in this war of trench warfare and the static stalemate war that happened in World War I. It was a truly awful war to fight in. Life took a lot of forms, and it really, the Western Front was hundreds of miles long, and there was trenches in the Eastern Front. Pretty much anywhere where this war extended, there were trenches, and it was unexpected, very unexpected for all these poor guys that signed up for war in 1914. They thought this war would be over quickly. They thought this war would be an adventure, and it turned into a nightmare for them. Here's the Western Front. This is the town of Ypres, and the Ypres salient. The Somme is actually right here for that offensive. Here's the town of Verdun. But this front stretches all the way up here from basically the English Channel all the way down to Switzerland, an unbroken chain. Some of these would be more active than others. Again, there's trenches, non-stop trenches, thousands of miles of trenches dug into the French soil. Looking above, this is how the French would set up. The trenches would set up. You had no man's land in the middle with a bunch of craters. You have the Frontline Trench. Right here, you would have the support trench, reserve trenches. The trenches at the perpendicular are called communication trenches, and that's how it was set up for both sides. Both sides have frontline communication and support trench systems. What was it like for these poor guys? Death was a constant companion. I think that cannot be emphasized enough, and it's very different for how we're living in the modern world. These guys could die at any time. It could be a random shell fire, it could be killed, it could be gassing, they could be buried, anything. So death and the stress of that was constant for these guys. Also, they could be shot by snipers. The movie mentioned this. They look over the parapet on the first day. They're in the ground. They want to look around, and boom, they get shot by a sniper. So death was everywhere. Looking at kind of a cross-section of the trenches, of the frontline trenches, you would have barbed wire entanglements set up here. The front line, you'd have dugouts. You could have pillboxes, which are concrete machine gun emplacements. Artillery would be well back from the lines, and this is the essential setup for all these trench systems. If you want to look at it, kind of what it would look like, this is a pretty good illustration of artillery in the back, and here are the frontline trenches, and you have dugouts, and some of these trenches were pretty elaborate, and it really just depended on the sector and what kind of earth they were digging in. Essentially, you could have a bolt hole, which is a small hole to jump into. Trench boards. They could have A-frame set up here. If there's a lot of wet, they'd have an A-frame with the trench boards on top. This is called fire step. So you could step up on here and then fire towards the enemy. Sandbags and your wire entanglements. What it looks like. This is a pretty primitive trench, and you see how the soldier is sitting up on a fire step here, so he could actually get up above and fire his weapon at the enemy. Again, this looks like a pretty early trench system. It's not elaborate, just a big hole in the ground. They became a lot more elaborate as time went on. So you look, about a third of the Allied casualties on the Western Front were actually in the trenches. Aside from diseases were a huge toll. Diseases actually killed more people in World War I than bullets or artillery. And as they died, these poor guys died. They had no place to bury them. Shallow graves, bodies were decomposing. Some of them just got buried in shell holes. I mean, it was really pretty awful to deal with. Here's a listening post. They would have these set up in no man's land with earth on top, and they could sneak up into these listening posts. Some of them would be pretty camouflaged from the front and listen in. Here's a periscope that they would use to look over the trench without getting themselves shot as well. Rats. If you talk about World War I, one thing that any of the people will mention is rats. Literally millions of rats would infest these trenches. There were two types, the brown and black rat. They hated both of them. They really especially feared the brown rat. The brown rat would grow, it would eat human remains, as gross as that is, and then it would eat their eyes and liver. I mean, I hate to say it, but if your friend died, and you woke up the next morning, their eyes and their stomach could be eaten out from inside, as gross as that is. And some of these rats got to be the size of a cat. People were afraid. They tried everything they could to get rid of them. It never worked. a single rat couple could have 900 rat babies in a year. And those would have their own, couple with 900. And I mean, just next thing you know, you get millions. They infected, caused infection in food. The only thing that was good about the rats is if they disappeared, you knew that shellfire was coming. Here, this is a picture. Hopefully you can see it, but this are from a rat rat hunt. That's a rat. Look at the size of some of these rats. They are as big as small cats, and these would be out of trenches. And these guys would kill them, and it didn't matter. The rats. In addition, you had lice. Lice was a never-ending problem. These guys were not bathing. Even if you washed the clothes, they had lice eggs invariably in the seams. Most of their uniforms were wool, which is a good place for lice to hang out. And it caused trench fever. They didn't realize that. Frogs were all over the place. They spread disease. Slugs, you name it. It was a pretty awful place to sit in. I mean, look at this landscape here that these guys are fighting in. All the trees, all the fresh, lush vegetation's gone. It's a moonscape of craters and mud, and that's what you're living in this entire time. Okay, so here's Little Kitten. If you're a little squeamish, you could fast forward the video here. The next slide is a little gross, so I put this slide in here kind of as a warning. The next slide is trench foot. Yeah, trench foot. Look at this poor guy's foot. It is literally eaten away. His toes have fallen off, and it's a fungus has taken over his feet. Trench foot, we mentioned, is caused if your feet are cold and wet for a prolonged period of time. Fungus takes in and it becomes gangrene. It was a huge problem, especially in 1915. They figured out that it was pretty easy to fix. Just keep your feet dry, and they improved the trench system, and then trench foot went away. So on a kind of a daily basis, how would these guys operate here? Typically, you would be in the front line for a time period. They'd move you back to support. They'd move you back to reserve, and then you would rotate you out on leave, and then you'd do it all over again. You could spend, in a year, you could spend maybe 70 days on the front, 30 days in support, 120 days in reserve, and maybe 70 days at rest, looking at how it all work out. And again, that would depend entirely on the situation, where you are in the front and what's going on. On a daily basis, they would wake you up before dawn. Everybody would go to the fire step, and this is they call it stand two. Stand two in the morning, because that's the best time to attack is at dawn and at dusk. Even though both sides know that the best time to attack is at dawn and dusk, and both sides knew that, and they put their men up to stand two to guard against a dawn or dusk attack, they still attacked at dawn and dusk, which makes no sense. That's just what the book says. They were very fixed in how they approached things. As it grew a little light, they would let them have a morning hate ritual where they would relieve tension by firing off and shelling the enemy side. So they just fire off a bunch of bullets to make themselves feel better and relieve some stress. Both sides would do this. Both sides would stand two in the morning and at dusk. When that was over, they would give some rum out. They would serve breakfast. Both sides served breakfast around the same time. And what you would have all over the place with these unofficial truces, kind of a live and let live mentality. If the other side attacked our breakfast wagon, we'll attack their breakfast wagon, and then nobody would have breakfast, and everybody's soldiers would be hungry. We don't want that. We'd rather eat our breakfast in peace. So they literally just took a time out from the war during breakfast. These things would come and go depending on the upper leadership would come in and put an end to those. Once breakfast was over, they would have chores. The sergeants would, these are NCOs or non-commissioned officers or sergeants, would assign the chores. Once those were done, there was really nothing else to do. You could have all kinds of things from latrines to fixing the trenches. Most of that was fixing the trenches or extending the trenches. Once that was over, here's flamethrowers too. German flamethrowers. Once that was done, there was nothing else to do. Boredom. A lot of this was boredom. Guys were constantly bored. They would write letters home, sleep when they can. A lot of activity happened at night, so they'd sleep during the day if they could. This whole elaborate system of trench art, which is actually highly collectible these days. This is a submarine made out of bullet casings. These are other bullet casings that have been carved by soldiers. They called it trench art because there was nothing else to do for these poor guys but fiddle with stuff. At night, they would have another stand two where they were waiting, guarding against a night attack. And then once it got dark, everybody went into motion because that's the safest time. Some guys would be on sentry duty. They would go out and repair the wire, name it. The sentry duty would be up to 2 hours. If you fell asleep, they'd kill you with a firing squad because that's dereliction of duty. They didn't want to do that, so they'd only have 2-hour shifts with a couple guys to keep everyone awake. They would go out to patrol no man's land a couple times. Go to listening posts and find out if they would meet each other in no man's land. It happened all the time. They could try to kill each other hand to hand. They couldn't shoot each other because that noise would bring fire down from both sides upon their position. So they would go hand to hand fighting, or a lot of times they just would just go on their separate ways. It's probably the safest thing to do. Here's a bunch of soldiers on night patrol going out over the top. Very, very dangerous thing to do here. Finally here, the smell. The smell was awful. You got bodies dying. About 200,000 men at the Somme alone were decaying in shallow graves. You had latrines that were overflowing. Thousands of guys. Unfortunately, they all go poo and pee. They got to do that someplace. Some of these guys didn't bathe. They smelled like probably the worst homeless person you've ever smelled. Unfortunately, sometimes those people don't have a chance to take showers, and if you've ever smelled that, it gives you an idea what they smelled like on the Western Front. The trenches themselves smelled, and gunpowder everywhere. So any visitor to the Western Front always talked about the smell, how bad the smell was. Just could go through the rest of this. Is just a series of photos. These are some of the artillery pieces. This gives you an idea. That's a rail gun. There's this gun here, well camouflaged, large artillery piece. This is a listening post. That's a shell going off. I don't know how they got this picture, but it's a shell exploded. It's near those guys. You have guys standing on the fire step. You see how muddy it is here. Really muddy. So they're standing on the duck boards, and he's got a periscope looking over the parapet, trying to go through the wire entanglements. These are dead bodies. These guys out of bodies. So these guys all died. They're guarding against another attack, so they have to deal with the bodies at a later date. This is afterwards, but you can see kind of how these things are built up. So obviously these guys are standing there. They're no longer in danger. Shell bursts going off, looking through bigger periscopes. And the last picture here, another shell fire going off. So hopefully you just got a good opportunity to kind of get a feel for the trench life in World War I.